Welcome to Tools for Freedom Media. This is your host, Makia Freeman, editor of the Freeman articles and senior researcher at toolsforfreedom.com. We have a very special guest today, Crrow777, who is with us to talk a little bit about his work. As you might know, he has posted some amazing videos on YouTube and came to some amazing conclusions about what might be going on in the world. Including a lot of revelations about what the moon is and is not, as well as perhaps other objects in the solar system. So just before we get to Crow, we're going to talk a little bit about, before we get to topics of revolving around outer space, we're going to talk a little bit about something closer to home, and that is the YouTube situation with Google and the censorship that's going on. So unfortunately, it's affecting a lot of alternative researchers. So with that, I'm going to introduce Crrow777.
Hey, Makia. Thanks so much for having me.
You're welcome. So tell us a little bit about what's happening with YouTube and your channel.
Well, to date, I have been very careful to post almost 100% content that I've created. There are some exceptions there. Mainly NASA imagery, which by their own standards say is public or royalty-free, open to the public unless otherwise stated. But having said that, there have been a slew of channels that have been just taken down or given more than one strike right out of the gate. Some of these channels have had copyright strikes placed on them from places like Pakistan, which kind of underscores, even if someone wanted to fight against that, it's very unlikely that anyone's going to be able to deal with somebody in Pakistan placing a strike on their channel. But having said that, these channels, at least a few, and I won't name them by name, they're legitimately critiquing things like false news, false flags, things like this, or even the encoding gematria or numerology encoding of news and the kind of messages we get through the media channels. So it's really kind of disturbing, and this is why I am pushing to launch my own podcast and going to try to work it so that I can fund my own media server so that my content comes off my server. And if anyone really wanted to come after me under those conditions, it would be a whole other game. They wouldn't just arbitrarily be able to push a button and cause trouble.
Yes, and I guess this is the problem when you get centralization of power with Google buying out YouTube years ago, and now Google being so connected with the NSA and with the manipulators of society. It's pretty easy for them to just censor things that they don't like, whether it's through it's creating some kind of technical difficulty or simply just putting up community guidelines which forbid people talking about things that are really just basic free speech, such as being anti-war. But for some reason in Google's YouTube guidelines now, you're not allowed to be anti-war or you risk being censored.
Well, it's crazy because last time that I checked, and it's been a while, those Google servers are in California. And to me, that would kind of demonstrate that they should be following the guidelines for free speech that we all kind of assume we have in this country, even though we all kind of know we don't have all the free speech that we were promised growing up as kids and, into our adult lives. The point I would make is what they are doing now is beyond the pale, and they're not even veiling it. What they're doing is coming after channels one at a time and, in some cases, giving 3 strikes all at once. And when you look at the channels that they've been hitting, sure, some things are being said, but the point is they are critiquing what's being presented to the public and to the world through media channels. And they're asking people to take a closer look. They're calling them out, saying these newscasts that you're viewing, these wars that are being reported on, may not be happening in the way that you're being presented with. So, yeah, it's a very disturbing thing. And I'm very hopeful that when I get my own podcast up, that I can generate enough funds to pay for my own media server to get the video over there. And this is really the conundrum. Google says, sure, we'll give you all the server space you want. Doesn't matter how much your video weighs or how many people view it. But the trade-off is censorship, and they look at everything that's going on, they data mine it, and in some cases, people who don't read the fine print, they own the actual media that you created and are uploading to their servers. So in the long run, my goal is to try to become self-contained and operating under my own authority.
Absolutely, yeah. And we wish you the best of luck with that. And we wish also everyone who's speaking out against what's going on in the world and standing up for truth and freedom to find a way to be able to do that so that they're not dependent, relying on YouTube income or relying on Google or YouTube in some way. Because, this censorship, it's... The West loves to talk about how they're into free speech and everything, but the censorship just goes to show it's really not that great at all. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about you and your work now. The amazing footage that you've been able to take of the moon and everything. Now, how did you get into this line of work?
Well, I've told this tale many times, so I'll kind of abridge it. In 2012, there was a supermoon, or a so-called supermoon, and I had family members over to view the moon that night through my scope, but we did it optically. At the time, I didn't have the ability to film through my scope, and my young nephew at one point during the evening said, Uncle, I see a black triangle. And so we all jumped up, and I ran over, and sure enough, there were black triangles transiting the moon. And this went on for 2-3 hours, and the reason that's astounding is because from our point of view, the moon appears to be moving through the sky. So for these objects to have remained between the end of my telescope and the moon is something to consider. But this all culminated, and we saw many that night going top to bottom, left to right, right to left. They were spinning, kind of changing directions, all kinds of stuff. And it culminated when my brother-in-law shouted out that he saw 5 to 7 of them in formation. And needless to say, the next day I was up at the scope shop figuring out how I could film through my telescope. And it was funny, at the time I thought, I'll never catch anything like this again. But anyone who goes to my channel will learn very quickly that if you simply take the time to observe, you will learn many things that you might not have thought were possible.
Yes, and that's what I really like about your work. You've got some real hard proof and hard evidence here that people can't deny. And, it's one thing for people to make theories about outer space and the moon and what's really going on there, and it is important, but it's also very important to have the hard evidence and the facts so that you can back up what you're saying. Now, having said that, I know you've had your fair share of naysayers and critics who've tried to debunk you, and they've claimed that it was a camera malfunction or this or that. Can you tell me a little bit about what you've had to kind of take with all these naysayers?
Well, the funny thing about equipment was out of the gate, that was the immediate kind of debunking that went on, which is ironic in a way because so many people come and watch like the 2012 lunar wave footage, which is the best we have, and it was the first capture I made. It was the one that began this whole thing. But they would say, oh, that's clearly, a rolling shutter effect, or they had a hum bar. They had all kinds of equipment-related ideas that were clearly causing this wave. But just by chance, the way that happened proved out of the gate, bulletproof proved that equipment played no role. And what happened was, and it's ironic on a lot of levels because I always try to keep the scope centered on the moon to increase my odds. For some reason, I panned below the moon and the wave started at the bottom. I didn't notice it as I panned the scope above the wave, but then the wave caught back up to where I had panned the camera to, and this has always been bulletproof evidence that it's a filmed event. Now, as it went on, the argument became, well, you're the only guy who's filmed this. And this went on for over 1.5 years until some other people began to film it. I think we have something like 9 to date, and I always lose track. We're between 12 and 14 or 16 captures. I'm not sure at the moment. Anyways, when that finally happened, it became, oh, it's a wave, an atmospheric wave that you filmed. Well, as fate would have it, in the 2012 footage and one other piece of footage that I filmed that captured a wave, there's enough ambient light that video manipulation can demonstrate that the wave is not crossing the video frame. This was discovered and shown to me by a video engineer. So these things were then presented to the public, and of course the naysayers kept on. But one night we had the 2012 lunar wave footage on a 62-inch plasma monitor, and the lights were out, and we noticed what looked almost like this weird cloaked blurry thing going on. And so I quickly ran over to the editor and I ran a find edge filter, and we noticed there's an energy pulse that occurs in the lower left limb of the moon as the wave is beginning at the bottom. The lines of this energy pulse are clearly curving as if wrapping around something, and as the energy pulse occurs, the wave starts at the bottom, and then there's kind of a lateral sweep that goes across the moon after the energy pulse and the wave begins. So the evidence kept mounting and mounting, and at this point it's pretty clear this is local to the moon, although, to be completely forthright and honest, the 2012 wave footage is the best we have, and it's the best by a mile. Now, why this is true, I just don't know, but I will stand behind that particular piece of footage 100%.
Yes, and what makes this really interesting is that now we've got other people catching it, and for me it really means that there's at least two possibilities, and there might be others I'm not thinking of, but I can see at least two. One is that the surface of the moon is deliberately being obscured, and that might be because there's bases or structures or evidence of extraterrestrial civilizations or even human-made structures, but something on the surface of the moon is being deliberately covered up. That's one possibility. The other is that the moon itself is a holographic construction and it's not a real physical thing. So do you want to comment on that?
Well, I think you're going down the logical progression that each of us who has seriously studied the footage and come to understand that it is in fact a filmed event that's local to the moon. Now, to take on the first idea that you pulled out, the idea that there's something covering the surface of the moon. Now, even though I don't subscribe to that now, I think it's entirely possible that the thing we see and call the moon may be covering something else behind it, a control center or Lord only knows what. But to come back to the idea that it's a hologram, I walked away from using that language because it obscures the conversation. People get caught up in, well, how would that technology work, and they go down this other path. So what I now refer to it as is a facade. Now, there's a few things that we can know. One of them is, in all the many thousands of hours I've been out sky watching and filming, I have seen more fireballs come from the sky than I can count. We're told these are meteorites coming from the sky. And while I don't know if that's what those things are, I can tell you that if they were in fact space rocks, a number that I have seen, a large number, look like they may have struck Earth. Now, when you look at the moon, it looks like it's been in a shooting gallery. It looks like it's just been endlessly bombarded by these supposed meteorites. And yet, in all these thousands of hours of filming, I have never seen anything move or change on the surface of the moon, to the point where I don't think it can be hit. And to top it off, I have begun to start to come to the conclusion that I believe the moon is emanating its own light. I don't think it's reflecting sunlight at all. And more will come on that soon, because myself and a couple people who are involved in kind of looking for the lunar wave are going to try to demonstrate that the quality of moonlight is vastly different than the quality of sunlight.
Well, that sounds like a fascinating area, and it will be really interesting to see what you come up with there. But getting back to this idea of the moon as a hologram, so you said you try to stay away from that word because people then get caught up in discussing what the holographic technology is.
Right.
So instead you're calling it a facade, but are you suggesting that, because the word facade is often used to mean, say, the front of a building that's covering something behind it. So are you suggesting that the moon itself is not a physical entity, or that there is something there and it's just being covered by something?
Well, I think maybe we can kill two birds with one stone. This conversation is probably going to get to the point when you ask me, well, wait a minute, how can it be any kind of a construction when thousands of years ago people saw it? This argument always comes up. The problem with that argument is that it doesn't logically succeed at the endeavor it's trying to get to. The people, presumably 1,000 years ago, saw a moon. We saw a moon. So the idea that that is somehow a argument to be put forward doesn't work. I mean, we're seeing exactly, presumably, what anyone 100 years or 1,000 years saw. But, and I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. Where were we going here?
No, that's okay. So you're talking about you prefer to use the language at the facade. So I'm just asking, do you mean to imply that that there is something covering it and there is something behind that cover, under that cover, or that it's not a physical thing itself?
I think that the moon may be some sort of a control center. And while I don't have enough evidence to back that up, other than some Russian research that has come to light, I think it's unlikely that if it is a facade, a construct, that it would just be put there because. And we see all these things down here that are attributed to the moon, tides, all these other things. But interestingly enough, if you quit just kind of swallowing and regurgitating what you've heard about tides and other things that are controlled by the moon all your life and begin to investigate, you'll find that some of the chief investigators of, say, tides as an example, there's a quote, and I know I'm going to mangle it. One of the famous scientists that was studying tides, correlating it to the moon, said something to the effect of correlating the tides of the Earth with the moon is where reason goes to die, or something like that. In other words, the harder he looked, the further away from the correlation that we all accept as true, that the moon is controlling the tides, the harder that kind of parallel becomes to demonstrate in any solid sense. Now, in my view, I think it's absolutely worth looking at, that we're looking at some kind of a control center. And when I use the word facade, my estimation at this point would be that what we see is actually covering that control center. In the Russian research, and I better kind of warn everybody, this research is posted on my channel, but at times when you're reading it, you're going to be saying to yourself, is this L. Ron Hubbard material that I'm looking at, or is it something more? The level of science and specificity throughout the writings of this Russian research, it's hard to dismiss as kind of an L. Ron Hubbard construct. But he stated that there is a black cube being covered, and he does diagrams about the thickness of the side of the moon we see and all these other things. But one of the interesting things that is talked about in that research is he describes the facade that we're talking about as being created by octaves. For the average person, that might be how we think of music in a way. And I think the more that I have learned about this, I really kind of favor going down that path as a possibility. And the claim that is made in that research is that there is a system between the sun, the moon, and the earth, and that octaves kind of do the whole thing. And to put a fine point on it, if that was true, and say the moon we see was tuned to one octave and the earth another, that would guarantee that no one from here can go there, or if there was someone there, could come here. And I think that, going down this avenue, and there are people that I am in contact with right now who are kind of trying to work on this to see if they can demonstrate in some fashion that this is going on. But again, I apologize. I feel like I kind of wandered off topic there. No,
that's interesting. Thanks for bringing that up, because I was going to bring up that topic. I assume you're referring to the Russian science Hadibov?
Yeah, and actually that's been corrected probably more accurately for the third time. I believe the correct pronunciation is Hadibova.
Hadibova. Okay. So yes, I did see that on your channel, and it is kind of technical, but what he seems to be suggesting there is that not only is the moon an artificial construction, but indeed the entire solar system's an artificial construction. Is that right?
Right. Well, in his estimation, we were taken over, and this is, I want to state categorically that the only real part of that research that I will back is the part that correlates with the lunar wave. As fate would have it, the three things that I came to believe were true about the lunar wave were echoed in that Hadibova research. And just so everyone listening has a breadcrumb to go down if they wish, there is a friend of mine who is probably the preeminent English-speaking Hadibova expert at this point. He runs a blog called Sage Sigma, where he has just categorized and translated this dense material in a very readable way in English. So anyone who's interested can kind of go look. But I will forewarn you, it is very sci-fi, and again, I will only back the portion of that research that really correlates with the lunar wave because I have no way to vet any of it beyond that.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. It is very interesting, however, at least the two parts of Hadi-Bova's research that you mentioned. The first being that the moon is covering a black cube. Now, through David Icke's research and other people who have researched Saturnian symbology, we know that the black cube represents Saturn. And is that a coincidence? Maybe, maybe not. The other point is that you're talking about Hadi-Bova's research having octaves and talking about how different things are at different octaves. And so that also aligns with what we know about frequencies. And the whole world is energy. Everything is ultimately a frequency. And so when you have things at different frequencies, you're right. They don't necessarily intercept until there's some kind of harmonization. So it could be if you look at the world from an energetic point of view, that with the Earth and Moon at different frequencies, that there's like a perception gap that we're not able to perceive what's on that other frequency.
Well, there's so many people out there kind of trying to demonstrate that this is a prison planet. And while I don't subscribe to maybe that language, I think what they're trying to point out is probably very correct. I have stated on the record that I don't believe anybody goes above what we would call low Earth orbit, and that includes machines. And I can't even begin to count how many hours of research looking at this idea once I had come to the realization that the moon landings and the Apollo missions were wholesale fraud. And that's not an opinion. That's a demonstratable thing. And this kind of underscores the problem with science. I'm not an anti-science person. Science has done so much for us. We have cars, we have refrigerators, we have air conditioning. We have all these things that we can use in modern life. The problem with science is it's become a bit like a religion, where if I was to walk into a scientific laboratory and say, all right, guys, today we're going to take all our scientific knowledge and method and aim it at the Apollo missions to demonstrate one way or the other whether they were true or false. What you would find is nobody is willing to do that because the religion of science has adopted that we went to the moon. And what makes it worse is the funding for most science, typically in universities. The funding really dictates what you will look at and what will be said about what was looked at. So we've kind of reached a point where the individual out there doing everything they can to demonstrate the falsehoods that we are now finding with the descriptions we were told in school, these people are critical at this juncture, not because science is a worthless thing, but because of the kind of bureaucracy and religious construct science has become. And as an example of this, I recently watched the announcement of the God particle finally being located, the Higgs boson. It was presented on NOVA, and I will state for the record, it was one of the most painful things I ever saw in my life. If you can watch that and not walk away thinking that fraud has just occurred, I'm not sure that we can have a conversation on any level that will matter.
Well, yes, and thanks for bringing that up, because that is often what a lot of people who are not alternative researchers, I think, is what they kind of their default knee-jerk kind of reaction when they come to this. They're like, well, you guys are just anti-science, but you have to understand that science is a tool for the people who are paying for the funding in a lot of cases, and that's how it works with say astronomy. But I've written articles in the past how the scientific research that backs GMOs or vaccines is just so fraudulent, and insiders have come out and said this. I mean, we've got people that are editors of esteemed medical journals, like they've been doing this for decades, and they're coming out and saying, look, much of the scientific literature today, perhaps as much as half, is just simply untrue, or maybe it's even more than that. And then we've had big pharma insiders talking about how, well, everyone knows that basically the pharmaceutical companies give money to the universities, and the scientists who say what the big pharma wants them to say will get a job, and those who don't won't. It's obvious. That's how it works. So,
it's really not hard for the average individual to look into what we're talking about and know pretty quickly the kind of global fraud that is going on, or I guess I prefer to say the worldwide fraud that is going on. As an example, when we look at Western medicine, which we're talking about big pharma, aren't we? It's mostly pills. And
right.
Anyone who's seen the commercials on TV, I mean, you'll hear these things said during a new drug commercial, like anyone with skin may not want to take this drug that we're pushing. Or, they've got a problem with eczema, and one of the side effects is possibly death.
Right.
We see these kinds of things. But for the average person, if you look into what's going on, here's one thing to question simply. We know, every person knows beyond the shadow of doubt, that anything that moves or lives is dependent on what is put into it. In the case of a human being, that is nourishment and food. And yet, in the Western medicine model, nutrition doesn't enter into it. The most you ever see about nutrition is, you have high blood pressure, don't eat so much salt. When in fact, there are people who, I will state categorically, cured cancer as far back as the 30s. The Gerson method is one of these things. And this is not an opinion. This was shown under scientific method to be true. And yet, when this was announced, within a month or two, treating cancer in this country with the juice of plants became illegal. And to this day, the daughter of the man who made these amazing discoveries, curing people of all kinds of cancers with simply the right combination of plant juices and some other things, she's forced to run her clinic down in Tijuana, Mexico, because it's against the law to give people juice here. Now, if you can know these things and not understand the level of fraud that has just kind of crept into the system, then I'm sorry to say you're sleeping.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there's fraud in every aspect of our society. There's no doubt about that. And I wanted to kind of move on now a little bit to Mars, because I know you've also done some great work on Mars, and you've got videos up there about that. And what's your current view of Mars? Do you think that there's also some kind of cover going on there, the way they're covering the surface and potentially hiding something underneath Mars?
Well, I think at the base of it, the simple thing to say is that every image you have ever seen of Mars was taken on Earth. It's being demonstrated all over the place that they're simply manipulating the RGB. You can take any image of Mars, put it in an editor, manipulate the RGB, and then you get an exact match for Earth. That's what's being done. I stated earlier that I don't believe anyone goes above low Earth orbit, and I think that was one of the places I kind of wandered off topic. But there are no rovers on another planet. They can't leave here. And one of the ways the average person can look at this for themselves, and there's a plethora of evidence they can look at, it's rocket launches. Go look at the endless line of rocket launches. As a matter of fact, there's a very good one that anyone can look up called, I think it's a rocket launch filmed from a plane, where someone, I guess, happened to be flying over where a rocket launch occurred. Now, what you see is these rockets go up, and then they arc out over the ocean very quickly and very hard. And if you look hard enough, you will find many videos where they're coming back down. But recently, there was a launch done in Florida, and it's kind of a very ironic story in that the world was shown one of these impressive rocket launches with this big, massive machine going up and up and away, but many people on the ground saw the rocket launch, and what they saw and filmed was something totally different than the public saw on their local news stations and national news stations. What the people saw was what they thought to be something exploding, coming apart, something going wrong and coming back down. And this kind of underscores how sleepy a society we've become, because you can go look at all this video where all these rockets just arc so hard out over the ocean, and yet they'll go to NASA And of course, NASA has this explanation with plenty of, in-depth formulas of why it's got to be done that way. But if you set aside believing what you're being handed and examine it with your common sense intact, and you look at enough videos, you will quickly see these rockets are not going anywhere. I had an image sent to me not long ago of a person who took a time-lapse still of a supposed GPS satellite going out, and it arcs all the way up, over, and down. And the person who posted this on Flickr was talking about how amazing this rocket launch to space was, and yet he was presenting an image that clearly showed a rocket arcing into the ocean. It defies imagination to consider how easily people are fooled into believing something just because they think NASA or somebody said it. And for the record, they are not leaving here. We are stuck. They are stuck. Not sure why that's true, but there is absolutely no evidence that is credible that demonstrates they're leaving here. And I would point out, in the age of high-definition video, everything that is amazing that can be filmed will be filmed, and yet we have zero footage of a rocket going all the way, with the exception of one piece of footage I was handed where apparently it was supposed to be a camera on the outside of the rocket, and it's clearly a doctored piece of footage. But another thing you will notice in these launches is right as the arc of the rocket begins to occur, almost all footage cuts in the same place. And I've put videos up challenging NASA to invite me with my tools to come film a rocket go all the way. And I'm here to tell you there is no footage, ground-based footage, of a rocket going all the way. And with my meager tools, I could easily film that.
Right. And I like how on some of your videos you've put up your primary rule, which is don't believe something just because you've been told it's true. And I think that's what we're really up against here, that a lot of people feel overwhelmed and they've been taught all their life to just obey authority, or at least not to challenge authority. And so they see someone in a black robe or with a shiny badge or a white coat, and they see an authority figure, and they don't think for themselves and challenge this. But you're right. I mean, the fact is that NASA, right from the start, was a Nazi kind of creation, full of Nazis, and then full of Freemasons as well later on during the Apollo years of the 60s and 70s, and probably to this day has just been a tool of the elite controllers to manipulate our perception of reality. And it is interesting, as you say, in this day of high definition technology, that we don't have any real footage and images that we can really trust. I mean, there are definitely researchers out there that are suggesting that all of these photos we have of Jupiter and Saturn, or all the planets and the moons, could just be CGI, computer-generated imagery.
Well, a lot of them can be taken from the ground. There are people out there now demonstrating that with the tools at their disposal, they can create images of a nebula or, say, Pluto or Jupiter that look every bit as impressive as what the supposed Hubble Space Telescope is giving us. But I'd like to jump back for a second about authority to kind of put some context around it that people can really grab onto. All through our lives, media, TV, movies have really influenced us. And if you go back and look at, like, Gilligan's Island as an example, whenever something comes up that's a scientific problem, but that's the professor's bailiwick. Whatever the professor says goes. Oh, we need a decision. That's the skipper's thing. Well, if you look back to the Leave It to Beaver era, and this is kind of oversimplifying, but it is something that demonstrates how easily we have been convinced of what we should or should not believe in. You go back to the 50s, all women on this planet were pretty much relegated to the kitchen. If you watch those old shows, a woman's job in society was to be making the food, cleaning the kids' clothes, cleaning the house. That was where her authority existed. So if you can extrapolate that out to the modern day and begin to say, wait a minute, that is not how we should be as a society. That programming is ridiculous when we look at it at this point. It's really no different than saying, well, these guys in lab coats at NASA said something, so we should just believe it out of the gate. So there it is.
Yeah, that's a good point. And so for someone coming new to this, who's not really familiar with, why the moon landings are fake and why we can't get past low Earth orbit. I mean, you've mentioned one reason is just the rocket launches, that we have no real footage of a rocket launch. But can you talk a little bit more about your reasons for stating that we can't get above low Earth orbit?
Well, I mean, other than in the HD age, everything gets filmed. I mean, it's just simple deductive reasoning. Let's take satellites as just a random grab. How come there is no footage anywhere of these amazing satellites in space doing what amazing satellites in space do? You would think that someone might one day poke a camera out the International Space Station window and film one of these thousands of amazing space vehicles up there doing amazing things, and yet that it doesn't exist. And as a matter of fact, if you begin to look up satellites online, you'll quickly discover that the images you get of satellite are cartoons, 3D renderings, this type of thing. So here we are again in the high-definition world, and yet nobody has ever filmed a satellite in space. But there are more blatant issues we can point to. Apollo 17, I may have that wrong, but I think it's Apollo 17 supposedly took a picture of Earth from space. That image is in every textbook on the planet, and it is still being used everywhere today, sometimes inverted, sometimes the cloud pattern has changed, same image, and yet it is not a snapshot at all. And if you look at the description of how it was made, you will find the language that everyone always overlooks, mosaic, telemetry, all these things that tell you this is a constructed image. That image, which was in everybody's high school textbook, was not a snapshot from a camera. It was a constructed image. How can that be? Here we are with HD everything, cameras that are simply amazing, 4K and better, and you can only imagine that a space agency must have something better than we can have as consumers, and yet we are still looking at the same old, tired image of Earth. Now, recently, NASA tried to answer this problem in the lie they've been pushing for so long, and I guess a new image of supposed Earth from space came out. I'm here to tell you, you have never seen any image from space that is not a construct. If it's Jupiter or another planet and it's not a 100% construct, it was taken from an Earth-based telescope. And I can tell you from firsthand experience, if you get a big enough telescope, you can get some pretty impressive images, and with digital technology today, by the time you've cleaned up the image, you could make it look like you were a few thousand miles away. And that does not even address things like adaptive optics and all these other kinds of technologies that the public, I guess, is never going to get their hands on, that are knowingly being created and implemented in the big observatories. But the truth is it doesn't take a lot of thought to consider why don't we have an endless array of images from Earth from space. And here's another thing. If you look at that Apollo 17 image, and then you go look at a Mercator projection map that someone drew on Earth, what you will notice is there's a problem here. The Mercator projection, we are told, was made because there were straight lines for sea navigation. And what it did was exaggerate the shapes of land masses. So if a real image of this planet was taken from space, there should be a massive disparity between what's actually filmed from space and what has been done on a Mercator projection, when we know, like the size of Greenland. And basically it was described once in a TV show pretty well, where they demonstrated that all the third world nations had been reduced in size in order to make the ruling class nations in Europe look much bigger than they actually are. The point I'm making here is if you're looking at a map that's correcting for a globe and exaggerating land masses, it shouldn't even resemble a true snapshot of this place from space.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. And it's interesting because I think I've seen that video you're talking about. It's like a clip from a movie. But just coming back to, you were talking about Apollo 17 and how the Earth picture that we all have in our textbooks is a composite. You may have also seen a little clip of the astronauts from Apollo 11, Buzz Aldrin and his buddies, shooting the Earth through a circular camera in the space in the vehicle they were in, and making it look like it was actually a picture of the Earth, but it was only round because the window was round. Have you seen that clip?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. It's just more fakery. You know what? Not too long ago, the Chinese got caught playing a similar game where they were claiming they had Chinese astronauts in space, and lo and behold, a bubble or two or three came off the astronauts, and it was clearly being filmed in one of these pools. And many people may be surprised to hear, if you look hard enough at some of these pools that have mock-ups of the ISS in them for supposed practice, there's a massive green screen that is hidden in that pool. But if you search hard enough, there are some images where you can get glimpses of it. Funny thing about that is that pool is almost always shot with a fisheye lens. And again, here we are in the HD age. Why? Or, when you see the Red Bull guy jumping out of the highest jump with a parachute ever, why are all the cameras always fisheyes? Well, I'll tell you why. Because they don't want you to see reality.
Right. And given all the footage you have of the moon and other objects, I know we've spoken a lot about the lunar wave in this interview, but you've also caught a lot of interesting objects transiting the moon. Now, can you speak a little bit about that, and also whether you think that constitutes, really good evidence of, more fakery, or whether you still think that the lunar wave is the best piece of evidence that you've caught?
Well, in my estimation, the things that we're filming have never been described to us, and I will state for the record, the hardest thing you can try to film is a satellite transiting the moon that you can identify as a satellite that looks like a satellite. I've never done it.
Right.
So here I've filmed to date 6 lunar waves, which is among the hardest things you can try to film, and yet I still don't have a picture or footage of a satellite that I can ID. And not only that, most of the things that we are filming, and I'm not alone, there's a guy in Houston, another guy in New Jersey that are filming the exact same things I am filming, are these little black round objects. And they're all sizes, many speeds. Some of them, when you film them, look like they're elongated, but when you freeze the video frame, you'll see that they're round. They're just traveling so fast they have speed blur. But let's put this into context. When you look up at the moon, you can put your arm out at arm's length and hold your pinky up and cover the moon with your pinky, okay? The moon is a half a degree of sky, roughly, though it's supposed to change distances, so it varies, but roughly half a degree. So we have filmed so many of these little black things up there zipping around that you have to come to the conclusion that the sky must be absolutely full of them. For us to be filming them in this measly half a degree of sky staggers the imagination. And so when they go between my scope and the moon, they're so well backlit because the moon is bright, we can see them well. But I have a full spectrum camera that allows me to kind of light the sky up. If I move it off the moon, I can make the auto lighting kind of kick in. Sometimes we can get traces of them beyond the moon, but 90% of the time we can't see them at all unless they're backlit by the moon. And again, they're round, they're black, they often have a halo around them, and they don't match any description of any kind of satellite or anything else that we've ever been handed. And it is so blatant, in my view, that I have made clips informing people that you need to question satellites as they have been described to you, because I don't believe for a second that anything goes above low Earth orbit, and I'm not even sure that what we call low Earth orbit could be considered as space in the way that you've described it.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and actually that segues nicely into what I was going to ask next, because I was going to get into the whole thing of the solar system, the sun, outer space. I mean, same thing. We've been taught in textbooks when we were little kids, this is the sun, this is how big it is, we live in a galaxy, and that's in another galaxy, and on and on. I mean, how do we even know that any of that's true? We don't. And I have clips up that question, with some pretty provoking thought experiments, the distance of the moon as an example. But what really begins to put it into perspective is when they did the global media launch on Pluto, that they were finally going to make it to this world way the heck out, so far away that it took forever to get there.
And I made an offhand clip because I saw just the low-level imagery that they were pushing off on people. And I made a clip saying this is all fraud. And I used some images that I took of Jupiter. I wasn't really putting much effort into the clip because I saw the images from NASA, and I said, I'll just put out a quick clip saying this is fraud. Well, what I did is I took a still that I took with my 8-inch telescope, which is a bit smaller than the one I use now, and you can see a number of the moons. And I forget the distances now, hundreds of millions of miles, we are told I am shooting Jupiter. And yet the images they were showing us of Pluto were within something like 7 million miles, and they were in space, they were telling us, with no atmosphere diffraction, no heat exchange, not all the things that I have to deal with, city lights. And I said, at what point does NASA's imagery have to be better than what I'm doing in my backyard? Well, a floodgate opened up. Gizmodo picked it up, the Daily Mail in the UK, and then pretty soon Newsweek came along. And actually Newsweek ran on me twice and made a print article. And while the majority of that coverage was belittling and unfair, Newsweek did a fair job. There was a troll attack that I have never seen in my life. To this day, the only video on my channel that has more thumbs down than up was that clip. So what I did is I went back and put some real thought into a follow-up clip because it was such an offhand clip that they chose to attack. They grabbed the low-hanging fruit. And I went at it and I showed that Pluto was discovered the same year the cartoon Disney character Pluto was made. I showed the Masonic connections. I showed all these things. And that video only got 20,000 hits, where the first video had, 100,000 or I don't even know, a lot more hits. And yet I embedded the second video right into the description. So there was real reason to believe that there was shenanigans going on there. And shoot, I lost my train of thought because Mars plays into this. Keep going. I'll think for a second because there was something that really ties into this that had to do with Mars, and I've caused lost for a second.
Sure. Yeah, we're talking about some far out concepts here, but yeah, I mean, it's just so interesting to me that they can, say with such authority, we know that the sun's this far away and it's doing this and this, and they don't have any idea. I mean, either they have no idea or they're deliberately making up a story, and the deception runs so deep. I mean, they're deliberately fooling us about, the place where we live, our very place in the universe. I mean, massive questions that are everyone's birthright to know, and these guys are just, telling us the most outrageous lies and trying to pull off the most outrageous deception. It's just quite unbelievable.
Well, it's all coming home to roost now, and I think there is real reason to consider that there are land masses here on this world that we are unaware of, and that their misdescription of this world that we live in is one of the many things it does besides keeping us all ignorant and making bad decisions our whole life, is that I think it's quite possible that there is a landmass that we do not know of or have access to. And when you look at things like chemtrailing, one of the vexing questions that was always asked me, and I'm stating for the record, chemtrails are 100% real. It is not an arguable thing. It is documented. It has been filmed by Lord knows how many people, and I have spent thousands of hours of my life filming it, predicting it, filming very weird objects around them. It's a real thing. But the question that kept being asked me was, why would anyone spray all this crap in the air if their kids were going to breathe it? And for the longest time, I was really vexed by that question. I thought, why would they do that? Are they immune? Is there some kind of genetic component here where what they're doing affects certain genes? I just couldn't come up with a logical reason. And then one day I got a comment on my channel from somewhere in northern India near the Himalaya that claimed they'd never seen a chemtrail in their whole lives, and they were sky watchers. And I thought, well, this is one guy. Well, then this happened a few times, people in that area of the world claiming that kind of known pure area of the world had never experienced people reporting on YouTube that there were chemtrails. So I started thinking about that. Then when the flat earth argument began to crop up, and they were using things like the image of that big mosaic round thing in the middle of the table that shows a flat map of the earth, I began to consider that if Antarctica is truly guarded by 47 nations or however many there are in that treaty, it's quite possible that there are land masses we're unaware of. And it's quite possible that there are places on this planet that are completely free of the effects of what's being done over the majority of city populations.
That's quite possible, and again, thanks for bringing that up, because I was going to go in that direction and ask you what you think of the rise of the Flat Earth movement, and I'll state first of all that I'm open to it, but I'm not a believer. I think they make a lot of good points. However, it's obviously a massive thing to prove that the Earth is flat, and a lot of their arguments seem to be based on the fact that NASA is totally fraudulent and putting out fake imagery. Now, that's true, but that doesn't mean that the Earth's necessarily flat. So go on. What are your thoughts on that, Crow?
Well, I think some very important key points need to be made here. This is the age of the individual. This is the age of breaking boundaries. In order to do that, organizations and this kind of bureaucratic construct that we've all lived our lives in, those are things you want to avoid. The minute you join a group, if that group starts with the best of intentions, we'll take the Flat Earth, and they're truly trying to prove the fraudulent description of this planet, which I will state for the record is fraudulently described, what happens is it gives an easy target to be infiltrated for disinformation, for any number of things to go on. And not only that, we're talking about an organization that's been around for, a couple hundred years, or I'm not sure how long, but a long time. So first off, I do not subscribe to the Flat Earth organization, and I never will. But within that movement, there are individuals doing hands-on, first-hand observation that are showing some incredible evidences that demonstrate this world that we live on has been intentionally misdescribed to us. Now, do they have the wherewithal to draw a new map? Well, that's where I really part ways, because I think it's critical that new fantasies are not created. My biggest pet peeve is to say, well, this is a lie. It's a fantasy that everyone's bought into, but here's a new one we can all believe in. Crow's new fantasy. Crow believes this, so here's the new fantasy to believe in. I think that is a huge mistake. What I think is critical is that the people who are working independently and making discoveries and finding evidences that can be demonstrated, those are the high-value people. And I would urge them to stay away from joining organizations like Flat Earth or any organization and just simply independently kick down the walls, break the boundaries, and then freely share with the world what you have found. Over time, the new map will emerge. The new knowing will emerge. I think that's where things are at. So for the record, yeah, this world is absolutely misdescribed. I mean, horribly misdescribed. But Flat Earth people, I'm sorry. I think what you're doing as a group and the individuals, there is fantastic information coming out of it. But I think the minute that you join a group, you have already undermined what you're trying to accomplish.
Right. Yeah, that's an interesting take. I see a lot of validity in that. I was going to next get into some of the things you've been doing with your videos more recently, and that is you've been talking a little bit more about the secret societies and the path of the sun. Now, is this the same kind of sun worship thing that people like Jordan Maxwell have talked about how a lot of these controlling groups throughout the ages, maybe all the way back to Babylon and Sumeria and before, have worshipped the sun, and how Christianity is sun worship in disguise? Is that the same kind of thing you're talking about, or is it something different?
Well, first off, I want to state categorically that I'm never going to down any religion anywhere, ever. When I communicate on my channel or anywhere else, I understand that people are coming from all over the world, and I further understand that what religion an individual happens to be has a lot to do with what part of the world you were brought up in. And while that's not 100% true, I think it's irresponsible to kind of tout one religion and down another. I think it's just more divisiveness that is used to control the masses. Now, to address the sun question, what I have tried to do is demonstrate that all the secret societies, if there was such a time as ancient Greece, if that has any validity, and there was such a thing as the ancient Elysian mysteries. It is my contention that what we see around us today, and everyone points to the Masons, even though the average person you see that's in a Masonic lodge is just a guy raising a family. This is all the upper level that we were talking about. They're encoding the path of the sun. If you go back and look at old maps, you will notice one thing very quickly. The equator, the Tropic of Cancer, the Tropic of Capricorn, the equinoxes, the solstices, and the zodiac are always marked on every single map. It was critically important information.